Have you had, how has your time been here in the suburbs of Atlanta, sir, more than anything else?
I love coming to Atlanta. Honestly, it's one of my favorite cities in the U.S. Like particularly the food scene. I feel like every time I come here, my brother and sister-in-law live here, so every time I come here, they take me out and we eat well. We were at a Cajun place yesterday, like this brunch spot, and I was just loving it. So I'm always happy to come to Atlanta. And as someone who lives in the UK, being somewhere where it's just warm, like it's wonderful. I love it.
Yes, and we, and I gave you my subtle hints about where to go before you get out of here. So you've got to go into downtown Decatur and catch Watch Fest and go and catch up with O'Sullivan's meanest BLT on the planet. And I'm not kidding. I mean, it will last you for a while. What I wanted to do this morning, and thank you for getting up early on a match day and hanging out with us, is I wanted to go through the teams on the continent. And I know that since this is your bailiwick, we're coming to an oracle to discuss these kinds of things. But I wanted to kind of start with a Cabo Verdean freshman level course and find out from you how they've done this. And I know that obviously, since not a lot of folks are paying attention to African football on the daily, it seems like it's being done in quiet. Is it really being done in quiet, and how did they piece all this together?
Yeah, Cabo Verde, to me it's kind of like a social experiment. It's like a social experiment where you take a tiny, tiny nation with virtually no resources, but you give them 10 to 15 years and you say, look, you're going to make the right decision at every step of the way. And in 10 to 15 years, you're going to be in the World Cup knockouts. Like that is what this team is. That's what this country is. I think there's so much that makes Cabo Verde a successful nation. A lot of it goes beyond actually the football. A lot of it goes into like the culture. Cabo Verde is one of the most kind of athletic countries in the world. From preschool all the way through to high school, there's a huge emphasis on sports, which is why they do very well at sports. Not just football; they're very good at handball, very good at basketball. And then but on the footballing side, what they've been able to do over the last few years is build a structure around the national teams to get them to succeed. So that looks like a few different things. They have built two technical centers, training centers on the islands, one in Santiago Island, one in Sao Vicente, which again is challenging because there's 9 inhabited islands in Cabo Verde. So trying to manage that is crazy. They on top of that, they've then built a brand new stadium on the outskirts of Praia. It's not a great stadium in terms of its location, but it's a good stadium. They've developed the kind of infrastructure to start bringing in players from their diaspora. Last year about 18 months ago, they hired their first ever full-time director of football, a guy called Rui Costa, who his job is just recruitment. It's just building these teams, and you see that success panning out. It's not just the men's. Their women's team played their first ever match in 2019, and at the net coming up women's AFCON in Morocco in August, I'll be there to watch them play in the WAFCON. 7 years on from their team being founded, they've qualified for a major tournament. They've just built the structures around this team in every single level of the sport to succeed, and it's remarkable.
And to see Bubista lighten up a massive stogie in the locker room. When you have someone who is a legend, who seems to be a calming influence and understands the place and understands the progression and not getting completely and totally just off the rails emotional at the slightest thing, he seems to be this calming hand that they really need, especially now that they are on this world stage.
100%. And let me tell you how strange it is to see him smoking a cigar, showing emotion, because he's one of the most emotionless guys I've ever seen. He's such a grumpy man. I remember after they qualified, when they beat Eswatini, bear in mind, this is the country's biggest moment, not just in football, not just in sport, like everything. This is the country's biggest moment. And I remember being there at the National Stadium, and the players are getting into like the little bus that they use to get from the stadium that's on the edge of town back into the city, and they're all partying. They've got the music blasting. They're having a great time. Everyone's having a great time. There's Bubista sat in the front next to the driver, yelling at them, like, "Guys, get in the bus. I want to go home. Like, let's go." He's such a grumpy man. But you're absolutely right. That kind of calm demeanor has set them up so well. Look, Bubista was a former captain of this team. In 2000, Cape Verde won their only ever trophy, which was the Amilcar Cabral Cup, which was a cup for like West African nations. He was the captain of the team that won that, and his nickname when he was the captain was he was the quiet captain. He's always been like that. He's a calm, quiet, introverted guy. But when he speaks, then you take him seriously. And I think that has been a huge part of their success is the fact that they've got this guy in charge who understands what this team's about. Look, he played professionally in Portugal, in Spain. He's only ever coached on the islands. He's never coached outside of the islands. So he completely gets what it means. And a good example of that is that when players join the team, because this team does have a lot of players from the diaspora, is he says in team meetings, in training, in all of that, any kind of official capacity, we only speak Creole. We don't speak English. We don't speak Portuguese. We don't speak Dutch because there's a lot of Dutch-born players in this team. We don't speak French. There's a lot of French-born players in this team. He's saying, no, you only speak Creole. And what that has done is it's kind of integrated the players from the diaspora who maybe didn't grow up speaking it, but maybe kind of can understand it, or some like Pico Lopez, their center back, didn't understand a word for it. He's now doing interviews in Creole, and I think that is huge testament to Bubista because that's not easy to do that, to make that decision. But by doing things like that, is he's just gotten buy-in from the players and he's gotten buy-in from the federation. And he's just managed everything so well.
You mentioned Pico, and Pico apparently in his spare time was watching like Portuguese and Creole programming on Netflix and trying to find ways to integrate and become adjusted to the language in that way. So I mean, you're going to do whatever it takes. When the guy on the touchline says, "No, we're doing it in Creole," you're going to learn Creole, eh?
Yeah, absolutely. And Pico is such a good example because this is a guy who's born and raised in Ireland, in Dublin. His mother is Irish. His dad is Cabo Verdean, but left Cabo Verde when he was 16. So in many ways, Pico has no connection to Cabo Verde. He'd never been to the islands. His dad is from a smaller island, São Nicolau, and he had no connection with this team. But I've interviewed him like half dozen times, and he speaks really proudly about the fact that like one of the joys of being a part of this team is being able to explore his Cabo Verdean identity. He now goes there all the time. His father-in-law was there for when they qualified for the World Cup. He came out with his dad to watch him. Like he's been able to explore this, his culture. And I think the way Bubista runs it allows for players to do that. It allows for them to kind of engage with the country in a way that they really never would have been able to otherwise.
And nothing like getting Argentina out of the blocks and the knockouts, eh?
Yeah. Your reward for having a historically brilliant group stage is you get to play Lionel Messi. I mean, yeah, it's brutal. It's brutal. But I mean, look, they'll be going into this game confident, 100%. Will they win it? I really doubt it. And you have to say they've ridden their luck at times. If Lamine Yamal started that game for Spain, do they get the draw? I'm not so sure because he's got the kind of magical ingredients to take apart any team. You would say Leo's the same, and he's not playing tonight. From what I can see, reports he's been rested for their Argentina's game, so he'll be fresh. But again, what you will say is this team will come with a plan. I would say of the three games, and again, I would have said this before the tournament, that this is one of the most tactically flexible teams we've seen in all three of their games. A very different game plan, a very different starting lineup, and so you can, whether or not they win, you can bet all your money that they will have a plan. They will have a plan for Messi. They will have a plan for Argentina. The question is it just a step too far? And, I hope not.
Yeah. So are you going to Miami?
No, well, I'm staying in Atlanta and hoping that they beat Argentina and come back to Atlanta to play.
There you go. That's the way. Right now, early juice boxes have Cabo Verde as a plus 1850 to win against Messi and friends on the third. We actually had early juice boxes on that one. Argentina minus 588. Looking at the remainder of the continent and how they've performed here in the tournament, you've got literally, I think it's pretty much all over the spectrum. You have a team in South Africa who you were kind of sitting there and you were wondering, okay, their early start out of the blocks, and you're going, yeah, and then they come up and bite you in the end. And then you have the same thing with a Senegalese team that took advantage of Iraq yesterday after a red card. It took a while for that engine to get warm, but then they put 5 on the board, and that moves them up the ladder in the third place things. What have you seen across the board from all of these others, good, bad, ugly, indifferent? What has registered with you here in the group stage?
I think it's been overwhelmingly positive. I think you put Tunisia to one side because they have been the great embarrassment, the worst team in this tournament without a doubt.
Yes.
But I think outside of them, I think you can only look and be impressed by what a lot of these teams have done. South Africa are a great example. Like they're coming back to the World Cup for the first time in 16 years. They hadn't qualified for a World Cup since 2002. This is for them to come back and get out of the group stage is really remarkable. And South Africa, I think, are great. I'm wearing a South Africa kit at the moment. They are, for me, I think, represent a lot of good things on the continent because they're a team where every single player that plays for South Africa was born there. The vast majority of their players play their football there. And, we saw at the Club World Cup last year when Mamelodi Sundowns came and really impressed. They beat Ulsan Hyundai. They pushed Borussia Dortmund all the way. South Africa performing, I think, says a lot about the kind of standard of club football. Mamelodi Sundowns won the African Champions League just a few weeks ago ahead of this World Cup. And other teams have really impressed. Look, I got to hold my hand up. Ghana have blown me away. I thought they were coming into this tournament. I thought they were shoo-ins to come last. I thought Panama would beat them. I thought they would embarrass themselves, and they've turned it around brilliantly. And I think that's kind of been the story is like all the teams have shown up in very different ways because, like you say, Senegal, if anything, were quite disappointing. We thought that they would, and they did push France for a half, but then fell apart. And we thought they would do better against Norway. But a lot of that for me comes down to they have a few internal issues going on behind the scenes, a couple poor selections. Kalidou Koulibaly, their captain, clearly it was time for him to move on. And when they did move him on, they suddenly put 5 past Iraq. So I think from an African perspective, look, prior to this tournament, only 2 African nations at a World Cup had ever gotten out of the group stage in one competition. We'd never had more than 2 get to the knockouts. And now we have 7. And after today, hopefully 9. It's Algeria and DRC could do it. It's a big ask, but they could do it. And I think for seeing all of this, it is so encouraging, and it justifies so many of us who have been for years and years and years saying that the way the World Cup is built is unfair, that it does not give good enough access to Africa. And bear in mind, this is a continent that's had to fight for its rights. 1966 World Cup is remembered for England winning it. What it's not remembered for is the African nations boycotting it because they weren't given a slot. They were given half a slot that they had to compete with against Asia. So we've had to fight tooth and nail. And look at the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. We saw for the first time every single African nation winning a match of the World Cup. We saw really, really good performance across the board. And this time we're seeing it even better. And I think it's just a huge justification. Look, the whole 48 team thing, you can say, it's controversial. I totally understand that. But the one thing that has done really well is allowed for proper representation. And that is something that we've been crying out for such a long time.
Yeah, CONCACAF the same way, where you're seeing Curacao come in and they get their first point. You're seeing a lot of these folks in CONCACAF that have been kind of flying below the radar. Haiti, for an example, going through everything that they've gone through in the last 5 years to get to this stage to perform the way that they have. You mentioned DRC. I want to get into the match today. DR Congo and Uzbekistan. And once again, if you're not paying attention, if we are not, subscribing to your Substack and getting everything that you are bringing into the atmosphere, we would be surprised that DR Congo would be in this position. But how surprised are you that DR Congo is in this position where if they win, they're in? If they win and put up a number, then they're kind of pushing the number 2 spot in the group. And if Colombia knocks off Portugal, then you're kind of like, hey, DR Congo could be the 2. But there's a lot in play here at Atlanta Stadium tonight at 7:30 here.
Yeah, 100%. And look, I would be amazed and overjoyed if they somehow overturned that kind of goal difference to overtake Portugal. It'd be amazing. I think again, it's not a surprise that they're in this position for me. Look, I went into this group. I said, yes, they're going to be battling it out with Uzbekistan for that 3rd spot. I thought they could get a point from Portugal or Colombia. Yeah, I thought it would be Colombia, not Portugal, but here we are. I think what DRC have shown over the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years since Sebastian Desabre has come in, he's transformed the way Congo approach football. He kind of came in after a string of foreign coaches who would stay in Europe or stay in South America, come in for an international break, coach the team, kind of do all right, not very well, and then go back home. Sabra moved to Kinshasa. He said, right, if I'm taking charge of this team, I'm taking charge of everything. I'm rebuilding the structures, I'm rebuilding everything. And guess what he's done? DRC are flying really, really high because of that. And, I spoke to a guy called Guy Bokassa, who's the under 20s coach and the under 23s coach, and he's worked closely with Sabra. And he's saying that, like, he has implemented this structure both on the pitch and off of it that has allowed for DRC football to flourish. Because you got to remember, this is a country of like 120 million. This is a country that's football mad. This is a country with a lot of football heritage and pedigree. So for them to be coming back and performing and returning to the world stage is huge. And it's, again, it's not a surprise. They've been building to this. They reached the semifinals of the AFCON in 2023. They've been building a structure. Since then, they've been able to recruit more and more diaspora players. Axel Tuanzebe and Aaron Wan-Bissaka are two very good examples of English-born players who wanted to play for England, but now have decided to play for DRC. And yes, there was a little skepticism at first from the Congolese fans, but those two have been fantastic. And look, DRC, the one thing that has surprised me is they've been good going forward, because I can tell you, DRC guarantee for me over the last 4 or 5 years is a really, really boring game. Like, they don't concede much, they don't score much. Like, that's how they play football. And if you don't believe me, just watch back that game against Jamaica, the game that they qualified for the World Cup in. It was dreadful, and they scored an extra time off a corner. But against Portugal, they were really attacking. They created more chances than Portugal. They had more shots. They had a higher XG. Yes, they scored off a set piece, but they brought a bit more attacking flair than I thought they would, to be honest. So I think for me, that's what's encouraging, because for me, the big question was, I know they can kind of hold Portugal. I know they can hold Colombia. I know that they can probably stop Uzbekistan from scoring. The question is, can they score? So for me today, that is the big question. And I'm encouraged based off of the first two performances. They have players who can score, particularly Yohan Wissa, who is a brilliant, brilliant player and kind of would die for this team. I've interviewed him before, and the way in which he talks about representing Congo is just, it's special, really, really special. Yeah, and he's a guy who buys into this. Look, in 2022, he's born and raised in France to Congolese parents, but in 2022, on his summer holidays, instead of going to Dubai, instead of going to Miami, instead of going to LA, instead of going wherever, he traveled to Goma in the east of Congo on the Rwandan border, the place that is at the heart of the red zone of Congo, where you're told you cannot go there at the moment the Ebola crisis is going on. He went there in 2022 just on holiday, posted a couple Instagram pictures of how beautiful it was, didn't say anything, just said, like, just showed how beautiful that part of the country was. And that means so much to Congolese fans in that part of the country. And that's why, this team is full of those kind of stories. This is a team where the players buy into what it means to be Congolese. So I'm delighted. And I think they can get it done tonight against Uzbekistan.
And speaking of Yohan Wissa, I mentioned in opening kickoff that I have finally been diving into Panini for this particular tournament. And so one of my first 4 packs that the boss got me, I ended up with a Yohan Wissa. So I
there
have
you go.
my Yohan Wissa out of the box. I also have a Kevin Pena, by the way. So that was pretty cool. Yes. The other sides, the ones that we know about, that we see a lot, Morocco, obviously, you look at them and, you're not surprised by them anymore. But Brazil and Morocco trading punches. Morocco ends up as the 2 out of their group. And you end up with Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast, as we talked before when you visited us from Foxborough, for me, the only thing about their consistency is that they're inconsistent. And, you don't know which Ivory Coast you're going to get on a daily basis, but they end up number 2 in the group. We have purposely held Tunisia away because of everything there. We've already talked about them. Egypt finishes second in Group G, and with the chaos that they had on match day last, you figured it was going to come in one way or the other. Then, Senegal finishes in third, and they're in the math right now in Group I. And then you have all the activity today. Algeria is a part of the math today. You're looking at, and we talked about DR Congo and we talked about Ghana. So right now, if all things being equal, we do have most of the threes figured out. We've got most of the matchups figured out. Involving the teams that are in the thirds and in the math, Senegal right now is 5th out of 8. They're at 3 points. They've got the best goal difference. Score in 5 will do that for you. Then Algeria's got a match to play. They are below the line. They are currently 9th at 3 points. They need a result, and then that would put them at 4 points minus 2, so that would put them basically in 5th. Then if DR Congo wins, that puts them at 4 points, and that slides them well up the ladder. Of the 3 question marks that we have going into today, how do you envision the threes coming up?
Oh, that is a good question. Yeah, I think Algeria are a funny one because you kind of never know what you're going to get from this team. They have some unbelievable attacking talent, unbelievable young talent. Ibrahim Maza, in particular, is just a phenomenal player. If there's one player you need to watch today, make it Ibrahim Maza. What a talent he is! And for them, they just need to get a result against Austria. You would think that that's the one that's a bit of a lock. Like, okay, that's all they need to do is to get a result, and they go through. As we talked about, DRC, the question is, can they get a win? Like, can they score the goals? But I think having watched Uzbekistan in the first 2 games, having watched DRC, you would have them fancied. Ghana, like I said, complete surprise package this tournament. Like I've said before, like they everything they've done has been unexpected because they were a mess coming into the tournament. But you've got to say, like, based off of the first 2 games and based off of Croatia's first 2 games, you kind of fancy Ghana, not to win, but they don't need to win. They just need to get a draw to come second. Look, I don't think they're going to catch England. I think England is strong enough to put 2 or 3 past Panama. So I think, first place is out of the question. But, the onus is on Croatia. Croatia have to win, or at the very least have to they have to win to get through. So all of the pressure's on them. Ghana can play exactly how they played against England, sit back, play on the break. So Ghana already through. It's just a question of whether they come second or third. Mm-hmm. But I'm confident that they'll, get a good result, actually, which is, for me, again, is crazy that I'm saying that. But the other 2, I think I would give them kind of like a 60% chance, like both Algeria and DRC. Like, I think DRC are better than Uzbekistan. They should win. I think Algeria are, even with Austria. I think they're good enough to get a draw. It's just whether they let me down. But which, again, would be unbelievable. If we had 9 African nations, it just would be ridiculous. Like I said earlier, the most we've ever had is 2 out of 5, 40% getting through to the next round. And we might be on the cusp of seeing 90% of the African nations going through. It would be incredible.
And yeah, we're not going to complain because that adds to the coolness factor of the whole thing. All right, before I let you go, have you had breakfast already, or are you going to get breakfast?
I've got breakfast waiting for me.
All right, so a microwave oven. I won't hold you too long. How do you? And like I said, I am recommending everyone sign on to your Substack because of all the coverage that you give. How do you cover an entire continent the way that you do? It obviously is not easy considering where you're based in England. How difficult is it for you to get the information that you want to cover African football?
Yeah, it's a challenge. There's no doubt about it. And look, I do a lot of traveling. Like I said, I was there in Cape Verde when they qualified for the World Cup. I go to all the AFCONs. I go to all the women's AFCONs. I try to make it out for other big fixtures, whether it's big derbies in club football or it's, the Women's Champions League, things like that. I try to get out to cover them. But it's a big continent. And I think that's, for me, the great thing is, I'm someone who covers it full time, and every day I'm learning new things because there's just so much depth. There's so much diversity. There's just so much weight to learn. And I think one of the joys of being a journalist is you just get to talk to people. I'm constantly talking to people and talking to people who know far more about their country than I do, learning about their countries. And I think for me, that's one of the joys of being a football journalist is, you have the sport that permeates virtually every country of the 54. And I get to go and speak to people about it and hear their incredible stories. I did a story a few months ago on Eritrea, who's returned to playing football for the first time in like 6 years or something like that. That is incredible because Eritrea is a football mad nation, but is kind of considered the North Korea of Africa. It's a closed authoritarian state, so we almost never hear anything about it. And so for me to write about them heading to the AFCON qualifiers for the first time in years, it's an incredible story. And I think for me, that's the joy of it, is just finding out more and more about all these incredibly diverse countries.
And that's why we consult you as our oracle with everything Africa football. We will see you at Atlanta Stadium tonight. We don't want your breakfast to get too cold. We will see you in a couple of hours. And thanks for coming in and crashing the party. It's always great to talk to you and get our education when it comes to things. We'll see you downtown tonight.
See you later, John. Thanks for having me on.
There he goes, Ali Howorth. He's going to go get breakfast.